Good morning, my name is Sam Queen, and this is my presentation about minimum wage policy analysis. I initially chose this policy as it falls under the category of economics, and that happens to be what I study. And I'm interested in the study of economics and the policy that can come out of it, so this just seemed like an excellent way to begin learning about that process. So let's begin. Itinerary. So we'll briefly be going over the introduction of the topic. I'll be giving a description of what minimum wage is and the issues surrounding it, history of the legislation that has occurred, the differences between the Trump and Obama administrations' proposals and ideals about the issue, different views on the policy in general, policy actions that are taking place, alternatives that might not be being discussed in House of Representatives or the Senate, cost-benefit analysis to those alternatives, and then my recommendations from them. So, introduction. Minimum wage is defined by the federal government as a wage rate to ensure people of all skill levels earn a decent wage and can provide for their household. The minimum or living wage was first introduced, and this allowed the government to place a floor on the labor market and help to stabilize the post-Depression economy after the economic downfall and the Great Depression of the 1930s. This, along with other Keynesian-style economic policy prescriptions, were a part of the New Deal, spearheaded by FDR, that led to a big economic boom in the late 40s and into the 1950s. This policy idea affects all workers somewhat, as most people, past and present, have worked some sort of low or minimum wage job. Most importantly, however, minimum wage policy affects low-income families, as they are the ones who are most affected by changes in policy to the minimum wage, which, good or bad. So what is the problem? While a guaranteed minimum wage rate is a good policy, there is some cause for concern. In economic studies, labor is divided into subsets that allow for further in-depth analysis and study of the causes and effects on different groups of people when changing policy. The largest of this subset is the production and non-supervisory positions group of labor. This group is exactly what it sounds like, so manufacturing, construction, service type work, that makes up about 4/5 of the United States workforce. The average hourly wage rate paid to this group rose by 2.8% from 2017 to 2018 without adjusting for inflation. However, when you account for inflation, which saw an increase of 2.9% over that same time period, their wages actually didn't increase. This group saw a decrease in average wage rate per hour from $22.62 to $22.59 on average from May of 2019 to from May of 2017 to 2018. There are some causes for concern. One of this cause, like I mentioned, is the rise in inflation, and this is due to fluctuations in gas and energy prices, according to some economists. There are unseen costs to wages. One of them is the, like I said, fluctuating cost of energy. Workers pay for the cost of transportation to and from work, and if those costs change, your real income or real wage rate will be affected by this. On top of this, while paychecks have been increasing in size, the relative purchasing power of those wages has remained stagnant for quite some time. According to the Pew Research Center, another theory for the cause of this declination in wages arises due to higher benefit costs. So things like healthcare, childcare, things that are needed for when the head of the household isn't at home. Combined with lagging educational achievement in the United States, restrictions to job switches, people leaving the job force, clearly our minimum wage policy needs updating, akin to the creation back in 1938, which stabilized the labor market then. So the history of legislation. This table is taken from the Department of Labor Statistics website. I just modified it down to show like more of the important ones, important amendments and changes that occurred. So in 1938, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, the first minimum wage was passed, and this landmark legislation is the driving force behind wage policy. Over time, wages have increased with productivity. However, major changes did occur to this act. In 1961, the First Amendment was made, which extended coverage to large private retail and service employees, along with construction-type jobs. 1966 saw an extension of coverage to state and local employees of hospitals and other public service employment. In 1990, a grandfather clause was added to the act, which covered workers who did not previously meet individual coverage, but whose employers were still operating under the FSLA. Note that 1978 was the first year that the minimum wage was equal for all covered non-exempt workers, no matter what industry. There has not been an increase in the wage rate since 2009, and clearly $7.25 per hour is not enough to live on, so some change must occur. This provides a nice segue into the current and recent administration's stances and actions about this matter. As previously mentioned, 2009 was the last time the federal government took action to increase minimum wage. President Obama and his administration were generally supportive of increasing worker bargaining rights and a general expansion of government spending to increase economic activity. His administration supported and helped draft the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which helped halt the Great Recession he inherited and save around 3 million jobs at the time. They also supported a bill called the Employee Free Choice Act, a reform to labor law that aimed to re-level the playing field between workers who wanted to organize a union and employers who would potentially want to stop this. This act failed to become law, however. Even though this act didn't pass, Obama was able to secure legislation that guaranteed a minimum wage of $10.10 per hour on all federal contracts. Some challenges that the Obama administration faced, especially later in his presidency, were budget deficit hawks in the Republican Party, which then controlled Congress at the time, along with varying state and local cooperation in raising minimum wages and boosting labor power in general. Comparing this to the Trump administration, they've taken a drastically different approach regarding wage hikes and economic expansion and activity. In 2019, the democratically controlled House of Representatives passed a bill that would gradually increase the federal minimum wage to $15 per hour, and including raising the wages of tipped employees. The Republican-controlled Senate argued that this bill would drive down economic activity in the middle of a boom, and Mitch McConnell and other leaders in the Senate have no plans of bringing this bill up for discussion on the floor, even though it has been passed in the House. The Trump administration also has issued various statements saying that its policies are driving economic growth and increasing worker take-home pay far more effectively and efficiently than what a wage increase could ever provide, and there have been threats of exercising executive power and vetoing any bill that got to President Trump's desk that involved raising minimum wage at a federal level. His administration prefers to point towards a booming stock market, tax cuts, and other federal subsidies for American industries, and an estimated $1.3 million job loss in total due to a wage hike. This estimation is provided by a study done through the Congressional Budget Office. Political actors. There are a multitude of political actors who are involved in the creation, regulation, and repeal of potential laws that affect labor and wage markets. Some examples in government include the Congressional Budget Office, the Office of Budget and Management, congressional committees including the Committee on Education and Labor and the Committee on Ways and Means. These actors can provide key analysis on potential pros and cons of wage policy, as the CBO and OBM analyze trends in data, general shifts in the market, and give reports on them, while the committees that I mentioned previously, Ways and Means and Education and Labor, can be spearheads for policy changes because the politicians that make up these committees are influenced by their constituency groups to push for certain types of policy outcomes. Non-government actors play a role as well. Interest groups such as the National Federation of Independent Business and the National Restaurant Association have chimed in about potential raises to the minimum wage as well. There is a grassroots effort called the Fight for 15, which organizes strikes and protests across the country. They advocate for an increase of the federal minimum wage rate to $15 per hour, almost a doubling of what it is now. Their work has culminated so far in the passage of the Raise the Wage Act, currently in the House of Representatives and sitting in the Senate floor waiting discussion. Think tanks such as the Heritage Foundation and the Economic Policy Institute help to promote their own agendas as well through academic research into the subject. On to stakeholder analysis. As the chart shows, the CBO and OMB support for wage increases depends mostly on the current administration's position on the issue, as whatever administration is in power sets out goals and guidelines for these different institutions. The CBO, for example, under the Trump administration typically leans against an increase as it goes against their belief of a bigger cost to job loss than increased wages would provide as a benefit. Even though these offices tend to be nonpartisan, they can still make recommendations based off the current administration. This line of reasoning can be used for congressional committees as well. However, the ones mentioned previously would generally be supportive of the goal to raise the minimum wage based on their constituencies' desires and public opinion, which is something that politicians care more about than a business group would. Speaking of those business groups, the NRA for short and the NFIB are against a policy that would increase minimum wage, as their higher-ups, Sean Kennedy and Juanita Duggan, respectively, are quoted as saying, "The wrong wage at the wrong time, implemented the wrong way, and it is a devastating blow to small business." And this is in regards to the Wage the Raise Act in the House. The Fight for 15 obviously would be in support of an increase, as this is their entire reason for existence, and it's based on the argument that $7.25 is just not enough to live on. The Heritage Foundation is a free market think tank that tends to lean conservative on issues like this, and they promote ideals of free choice and turning towards the market to solve issues like this, while the Economic Policy Institute generally creates content that is in support of worker empowerment. In the stakeholder analysis chart of power and position, I placed the various actors in the chart. The NFIB and NRA are opponents of raises, and they have some influence over legislation, but that's dependent on how much money they have and use each year for lobbying. The Heritage and the EPI are similar in their structure and influence, but they're on opposing sides of the debate. They can help push for policy outcomes and do research, but have no direct ability to create change regarding policy. The various government agencies, the CBO and the OMB, typically gather and analyze data to view trends in economic activity and tend to stay nonpartisan on the issue. Congressional committees have the most power compared to the rest of the actors in the field, as they can create amendments and introduce new bills to the floor directly. The Fight for 15 has the most extreme placing, since generally they are a single issue group. Some potential alternatives. From my own research, I found 3 potential policy ideas that offer an alternative view to how we regulate wages. Mandated wage floors, earned income tax credit, EITC, and wage subsidies, along with school-to-work programs. Analyzing these potential policies through a cost-benefit lens, we see that a boost in the wage floor moves the equilibrium up the demand curve for labor, which is a benefit to labor as higher wages will be given out, but the cost to that would be potential job loss. This trade-off between higher wages and lower employment assumes that markets are in equilibrium, which may not be the case. The EITC pays subsidies to workers in the form of a refundable tax credit given out to typically low-income laborers and individuals. This theoretically shifts the supply curve for labor outward, which decreases market wages as the supply of labor would increase. But then that provides compensation in the form of a tax credit, which tends to theoretically equal out. School to work policies would increase productivity as higher skilled laborers enter the market, which shifts the demand curve outward for labor and raises employment rates. The main drawback of this program would be that it cuts out older workers who cannot or will not go back to school to learn a new skill, and could potentially put too much of an emphasis on a specific skill development versus like general academic and life success. Recommendations that I personally would make are develop policies that pay workers based on productivity, that falls in line with traditional economic models of the firm where total profits are zero after wage payment and reinvestment in the firm. Keep in mind that economic profit and profit from a sale are two different concepts. What I'm recommending is after all revenue and costs are added and the price and quantity are theoretically equal in the market, the firm has paid workers their deserved wage while also reinvesting in the firm itself. This, coupled with legislation that allows for worker empowerment in the form of bargaining rights with employers, in my mind, would effectively close the ever-widening pay gap between those at the top and those at the bottom of the pay scale. And my references for the presentation. Thank you for your time, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your week.